Flint Hills, Kansas, September 1903. The wind, even in the gentler days of autumn, had a will. It scoured the endless undulations of tall grass prairie, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant horizons. On a small plot of land, miles from the nearest town, Ondrej Dvorak was building something that defied the simple, brutal logic of the plains. He was building 4 cabins. This alone was not strange. What was strange was their arrangement. 4 identical 16 by 16-foot squares, positioned to form a larger square, with a narrow 4-foot gap between them. To the cattlemen and farmers who rode past, it looked like the start of a miniature, nonsensical village. Leland Stroud, a cattleman whose herd grazed over 1,000 acres of the surrounding hills, reined in his horse one afternoon, watching Dvorak hoist another timber into place. Stroud was a man carved from the Kansas landscape, lean, weathered, and deeply skeptical of anything that hadn't been proven over 100 brutal winters. With him were Silas Croft and Elias Vance, men who had lost livestock, and nearly more, to the killing cold. "What in God's name is that, Dvorak?" Stroud called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind. "Planning on starting a town, are you?" Ondrej Dvorak, a compact man with the powerful forearms of a lifelong craftsman, paused his work. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and looked at the horseman. He said nothing. Silas Croft, a granger whose face was a permanent mask of worry, shook his head. "It's madness. 4 cabins, 4 times the walls to lose heat, 4 times the firewood. The man's building a monument to freezing." "I heard he's planning 1 roof over the whole lot," Vance, the shopkeeper, added with a dry chuckle. "1 giant kite to catch the winter wind and fly them all to Missouri." The mockery was constant, a low hum of disapproval from the scattered community. They called it Dvorak's Folly, or the Bohemian box. The design violated every hard-won piece of frontier wisdom. A defensible home was a single, tight structure, small, low-roofed, with 1 door and few windows, a bastion against the relentless wind and cold. Dvorak was building something porous, something complicated. Stroud's skepticism was more pointed, rooted in the harsh economics of survival. "I've seen the foundation for the chimney," he said, directing his words to Ondrej. "It's in the center of that whole mess. 1 chimney for 4 families." Ondrej finally spoke, his English careful and accented. "1 fire," he confirmed, his gaze steady. "1 fire," Stroud repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "You're tying 4 families' fortunes to 1 man's fire, Dvorak. If 1 family gets sick, if 1 man can't pay his share for wood, do all 4 families freeze for his failure? It's foolishness. On the prairie, a man stands on his own." He gestured at the strange configuration of frames. This is just asking for trouble." Ondrej Dvorak picked up his hammer, its weight familiar in his hand. He looked at the structure, not as it was, but as it would be. He turned back to Stroud. "A man stands on his own," he said quietly, "and freezes on his own." Then he returned to his work. The rhythmic percussion of his hammer blows the only reply to their laughter. What did this Bohemian stove maker, this quiet immigrant from a land of crowded villages and ancient forests, understand about the physics of convection that a lifetime of prairie survival had taught these self-reliant cattlemen to miss? Before we uncover the secrets of Ondrej Dvorak's strange design and witness the brutal winter that would test it to its limits, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten stories of ingenuity. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand a fundamental principle of how heat moves and how 1 clever idea can turn 4 desperate families into a single, resilient home. Let us know in the comments below. What's the most unusual house design you've ever seen? And did it work? Ondrej Dvorak was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor a frontiersman. In his homeland of Bohemia, in a small village near the great brewing city of Plzeň, he had been a kamnaz, a stove maker. But this simple translation failed to capture the essence of his trade. He did not hammer together simple iron boxes. He was an architect of warmth, a craftsman who worked with massive, intricate structures of ceramic tile, brick, and mortar. He built kachelöfen, monumental masonry heaters, that were the heart of a home. These were not mere appliances. They were integrated systems, designed with a labyrinth of internal channels that extracted every last calorie of heat from a single load of wood. A fire lit in the morning would radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth for 24 hours. His craft was the art of capturing, storing, and distributing heat, of making one fire do the work of four. He understood heat not as a fleeting comfort, but as a tangible substance to be managed, moved, and contained. He had come to America with his wife Eliska, and their two small children, Thomas and Anika, drawn by the promise of land. They arrived in Kansas with little more than his tools and a deep cellular memory of how to stay warm. The land agent had sold them a plot in the Flint Hills, a place whose stark, treeless beauty was a world away from the dense forests of his home. Their first winter in 1902 was a lesson in humility. They lived in a standard homesteader's cabin, a 16 by 20-foot box of green cottonwood lumber, chinked with mud and grass. Ondrej had built the tightest walls he could, and the most efficient stone fireplace he knew how. But it was not enough. The Kansas wind was a physical entity, a predator that clawed at the walls, seeking every pinhole, every crack. The mortar on his fireplace, made with local clay, cracked in the intense freeze-thaw cycles. The green wood they had managed to buy sizzled and fought, giving more smoke than heat. The cold was an occupying force inside their home. By 2 in the morning, the fire would have died down to a bed of sullen coals, and the temperature inside the cabin would plummet to match the single digits outside. Ondrej and Eliska would wake to the sight of their own breath fogging in the moonlight, filtering through the icy window pane. They slept with the children huddled between them, buried under every blanket and coat they owned. Anika developed a persistent, rattling cough that terrified them. It was a winter of shivering, of constant, exhausting labor spent feeding a fire that gave them almost nothing back. Ondrej, the master of heat, was being defeated by a simple wooden box. He felt the bitter irony like a physical pain. He had failed his family. That spring, as the prairie grass returned to life, he swore he would not face another winter like that. He would not fight the Kansas cold with Kansas methods. He would fight it with Bohemian physics. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of effort, but of design. It was a thermal sieve. The settlers built with the materials at hand, mostly cottonwood, a soft, porous timber that warped as it dried, opening up countless gaps for air infiltration. The single-wall construction offered almost no insulation. The thin layer of wood had an R value of barely 1. A modern home has walls with an R value of 13 to 21. The primary flaw, however, was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. The typical homesteader's cabin was heated by a small cast iron stove or a large stone fireplace. Both operated on the same principle. They radiated heat in a direct line of sight. If you stood near the stove, you were warm. Perhaps too warm. 10 feet away, you were freezing. The air in the cabin would stratify, with a layer of hot air pooling uselessly at the ceiling, while the floor remained ice cold. This hot air was the cabin's most valuable commodity, and the structure was perfectly designed to waste it. It leaked through the uninsulated roof, through the gaps in the ceiling planks, and up the massive, undamped chimney flue. A family might burn through a cord of wood, a tightly stacked pile measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, in just a few weeks of bitter cold. The problem wasn't a lack of fire. The problem was a container that couldn't hold the warmth the fire produced. For their neighbors, the Miller family, this was a grim reality. With 3 young children in a cabin identical to the Dvoraks' first home, their winter was a constant battle. Ice formed in crystalline ferns on the inside of their window glass. A bucket of water left by the door would be skimmed with ice by morning. They hung blankets over the doorway and stuffed rags into the window frames, but the drafts were relentless. The wind would make the candle flames dance and flicker, a constant, taunting reminder of the cold air pouring in. Their woodpile, which had seemed immense in October, shrank with terrifying speed. They were living in a machine for burning wood, not a home for keeping people warm. The conventional wisdom had produced a conventional failure, repeated in 1,000 identical cabins across the prairie. Ondrej began his project in late summer. He purchased 4 identical lots from the land office, forming a perfect square. He felled, stripped, and notched his own timbers, working with a methodical pace that ignored the curious glances and muttered comments of his neighbors. He laid 4 separate stone foundations, each for a 16 by 16 foot cabin. The 4 cabins were arranged like numbers on a die, with a 4-foot wide space, a breezeway separating them from each other. As the 4 small structures took shape, the mockery intensified. Leland Stroud rode by again, this time with a grim certainty. "You see, Dvorak," he said, gesturing with a gloved hand. "Each of those cabins has 2 exterior walls and 2 interior walls. The 2 interior walls face each other across that gap. That's a huge amount of surface area to lose heat. You've built 4 ice boxes instead of 1. Ondrej simply nodded and continued his work. "The walls are not the point," he said, more to himself than to Stroud. The next stage of construction silenced the laughter and replaced it with sheer bewilderment. Ondrej did not build 4 separate roofs. Instead, he began constructing a single, massive hip roof that spanned the entire complex. It soared over the 4 cabins and the breezeways between them, creating one vast, unified attic space. It was an enormous structure, nearly 40 feet square, a single shield against the sky. Now the 4 cabins looked less like separate buildings, and more like rooms within a much larger, stranger house. In the exact center of the compound, in the open-air intersection of the 2 breezeways, he had built a massive multi-flue chimney base of fieldstone and fire brick. It rose from the ground, like the trunk of a great tree. This was where the 1 stove would sit, a large, efficient cast-iron model, but still, just one. It would stand exposed to the elements in the covered, but unwalled, central courtyard. "He's putting the stove outside," Silas Croft declared to anyone who would listen at the general store. "The man is certifiably insane. The heat will blow away before it ever reaches a wall." Stroud's objection deepened. It was no longer just about economics. It was about the sheer physical absurdity of it all. "Dvorak, the wind will howl through those breezeways like a canyon. Your stove will be worthless. You'll be lighting a match in a hurricane." Ondrej was on a ladder, fitting the final rafters into place. He paused and looked down at Stroud. "The wind will not go up," he said, tapping a rafter above his head. "The heat will." He offered no further explanation. 3 other families, 2 of them fellow immigrant families, also weary of the prairie's harsh lessons, the German Schmidts and the Ukrainian Petrenkos, and 1 American family, the Walshs, had agreed to join his experiment. They had suffered through their own first winters and were desperate enough to trust Ondrej's quiet confidence over the loud certainty of their neighbors. They contributed their labor and what little money they had. Their trust was a heavy weight on Ondrej's shoulders, but it was also a confirmation. They too knew the old way was broken. Leland Stroud watched them work, a knot of frustration in his gut. He was not a cruel man. He genuinely believed this Bohemian was leading 4 families, including women and children, into a disaster. "You are tying 4 families' fortunes to one man's fire," he repeated, his voice strained with genuine concern. "If one man can't buy wood, do all 4 freeze?" Ondrej's new partner, Mr. Walsh, a quiet farmer from Ohio, answered this time. He looked Stroud in the eye. "We're buying our wood together, Mr. Stroud," he said simply, "and we'll keep it stacked right here in the middle, where we can all see it. We reckon 4 families watching the woodpile is safer than 1. Stroud had no answer to that. He shook his head and rode away, convinced he would be back in January, helping to carry frost-bitten children out of this monument to foolishness. To understand the genius of Dvorak's folly, one must understand the simple, powerful physics of convection. Heat is energy, and it moves in 3 ways: conduction, through direct contact; radiation, through electromagnetic waves; and convection, through the movement of fluids like air or water. A traditional cabin stove used radiation to heat the objects around it, but a huge portion of its energy was spent heating the air. Hot air is less dense than cold air. It weighs less per cubic foot. As a result, it rises. This is the simple, immutable law that Ondrej Dvorak built his entire design around. In a standard cabin, this rising hot air was a wasted resource. It would pool at the 8-foot-high ceiling, where it would quickly find its way out through the leaky roof, or it would simply sit there, far above the shivering occupants. The coldest air in the room would sink to the floor, creating uncomfortable drafts as it was pulled towards the stove to be heated, perpetuating a cycle of inefficiency. Ondrej's design didn't fight this principle. It harnessed it. The single stove was placed in the central open-air courtyard. When it was lit, it would heat the column of air directly above it. This superheated air had only one place to go: up. It rose into the enormous, unpartitioned attic space that capped the entire 4-cabin structure. This attic, measuring nearly 1,600 square feet, became a massive contained reservoir of hot air, a thermal battery. It was, in effect, a lake of heat suspended above the 4 homes. Because the single large roof was carefully constructed and sealed, this trapped lake of hot air could not easily escape. Its temperature would climb, reaching well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, even on a frigid day. This trapped heat then performed its second critical function. The floor of the attic was, of course, the ceiling of the 4 cabins below. The hot attic air warmed these ceilings through conduction. The warmed ceilings, in turn, radiated their heat downwards into the living spaces. Each cabin's ceiling became a single, giant, gentle radiator, warming the entire room evenly from above. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The heat was pervasive and constant. It eliminated the stratification of air that plagued conventional cabins. The warmest part of the room was now the ceiling, exactly where it needed to be to radiate heat down onto the people below. Furthermore, the design fundamentally altered the thermal dynamics of each individual cabin. In a standalone structure, all 4 walls are exterior walls, bleeding heat into the cold outside air. In Ondrej's quad, each cabin had only 2 exterior walls. The other 2 walls faced the interior breezeways, which, while not heated directly, were sheltered from the wind and were significantly warmer than the outside. The shared walls between cabins were losing heat not to a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit winter wind, but to another living space at a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. This simple geometric arrangement instantly cut the primary heat loss from the walls by more than half for each family. Ondrej Dvorak hadn't just built 4 cabins under one roof. He had created an ecosystem of shared warmth, where the heat lost from one home helped to warm another. The ice storm arrived in the third week of January. It began not with snow, but with a chilling, persistent rain that fell into a world already frozen solid. Every branch, every blade of grass, every fence wire was instantly encased in a clear, thickening sheath of ice. The temperature plummeted, settling at a merciless 20 degrees below zero. For 5 days, the world outside was a glittering, static, and deadly beautiful prison. The wind returned, not a howling gale, but a steady, crushing pressure that drove the cold through the smallest of cracks. Travel was impossible. The roads were sheets of glare ice. For the isolated homesteads, there would be no help, no resupply. They were on their own, with only the resources they had on hand. For Leland Stroud, the storm was a siege. The ice brought down a section of his fence line, and he spent a brutal afternoon in the wind-driven sleet trying to repair it, his hands growing numb and useless inside his thick gloves. Inside his well-built conventional ranch house, his wife kept the large stove roaring. The demand for fuel was insatiable. Stroud watched his meticulously stacked woodpile diminish at a terrifying rate. He was burning twice what he normally would, just to keep the main room of the house above 60 degrees. The bedrooms were frigid, the windows opaque with frost. The Miller family was in a far more desperate state. Their well pump froze solid on the second day. They were forced to melt ice for water, a slow, fuel-intensive process. They abandoned all but one room of their small cabin, hanging every blanket they owned over the doorways to the others. They all slept, ate, and lived in a 10 by 10 foot space, huddled near a stove that seemed to consume wood with no discernible effect on the room's temperature. In Dvorak's folly, the rhythm of life was unnervingly normal. The 4 families had laid in a communal supply of wood, stacked and protected from the ice in the sheltered breezeways. They took turns tending the central stove, a steady, methodical duty. A single, efficient fire burned day and night. Inside the Dvorak cabin, Eliska had strung a line across the room. On it hung a small load of laundry, Thomas's shirts, Anika's socks, a dish towel. They were not steaming, not drying quickly as they would by a roaring fire. They were simply, impossibly, drying. The gentle, radiant heat from the ceiling above created a constant, even warmth throughout the entire 16 by 16 foot space. The air was still. There were no drafts to make the lamp flame gutter. The windows had a fine mist of condensation at the bottom, but no ice. Thomas and Anika were playing on a braided rug on the floor, dressed in woolen sweaters but not their heavy outdoor coats. The same scene was repeated in the Schmidt, Petrenko, and Walsh cabins. 4 separate homes, 4 families living in a calm, quiet warmth, all sustained by a single fire they could not see. On the 4th day of the storm, Leland Stroud stood on his porch, the cold so intense it felt like a pressure against his chest. He was tired. The constant chore of feeding the fire, of fighting the cold, was wearing him down. He looked out over the crystalline landscape, his gaze drawn to the strange, square silhouette of Dvorak's compound a half-mile away. And then he saw it. From the central chimney of the quad, a single, lazy plume of gray smoke rose into the still, frigid air. It was a calm, efficient breath, not the panicked, billowing smoke he saw from his own chimney or from the Miller place. One fire. He knew 4 families lived there, 32 exterior walls, if you counted them all, and yet one single, calm fire. The physics of it was a slap in the face. He was burning a mountain of wood to heat 1 house. Dvorak was using a fraction of the fuel to heat 4. The visual evidence was stark, irrefutable, and deeply unsettling. His certainty, built on a lifetime of hard-won experience, began to crack. He had to see it. He had to understand. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf over his face, and set out. his boots crunching on the ice-crusted snow. The walk was a battle against the wind and the treacherous ground. By the time he reached the compound, his beard was stiff with ice. He didn't go to Dvorak's door. He went to the cabin on the far corner, the Walsh's place. He was driven by a need to test the most extreme point of the system. This cabin was the furthest from his own, the one he assumed must be the coldest. He steeled himself for what he expected to find: a shivering family, huddled in misery, regretting their foolish trust in the Bohemian. He expected a blast of frigid air when the door opened, the smell of cold and damp. He knocked. Mr. Walsh opened the door. What Stroud felt was not a blast of cold, but a gentle, inexplicable wave of warmth that washed over his frozen face. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a stove, but a soft, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He stepped inside, his eyes wide. The room was calm, quiet, and evenly lit. Mrs. Walsh sat in a rocking chair, mending a shirt, and there, strung across the corner of the room, was a line of damp socks, slowly drying in the impossible air. There was no fire in their small, unused corner stove. There was no stovepipe connected to the chimney. His gaze fell on the ceiling, the simple pine boards. He reached up a bare hand, expecting to feel the biting cold of the attic space above. His palm met a surface that was distinctly, undeniably warm. The feeling was so contrary to every law of nature he knew that he snatched his hand back as if burned. He looked at Walsh, his face a mask of confusion. Walsh simply smiled and nodded toward the center of the compound. Stroud walked, dazed, into the open breezeway. The air here was colder, but shielded from the wind. In the center stood the stove, a gentle roar coming from within its iron belly. The heat radiating from it was immense. He looked up into the vast, dark attic space, and finally he understood. The rising heat, the trapped lake of warmth, the radiating ceilings. It was all so simple, so elegant. He had been so focused on the walls, he had completely forgotten about the sky. Ondrej Dvorak came out of his cabin, having seen Stroud arrive. He stood, waiting, his expression unreadable. Stroud turned to face him, the ice in his beard beginning to melt and drip onto his coat. He looked at the 4 cabins, the shared roof, the single plume of smoke. The cattleman, the pragmatist, the man who believed only in what he could see and touch, had just touched the impossible. "My God, Dvorak," Leland Stroud said, his voice hoarse with awe. "You didn't build a house. You built a lung." When the great ice storm of 1903 finally broke, the stories began to circulate. They were told first by the Walsh, Schmidt, and Petrenko families, then by a humbled and converted Leland Stroud. Stroud became the Dvorak Quad's most fervent and credible advocate. He didn't just tell the story, he used his standing in the community to ensure it was heard. He rode to Cottonwood Falls and went directly to the office of the Abernathy Lumber and Supply Company. Frank Abernathy was a shrewd businessman who had sold lumber for hundreds of conventional cabins. He listened to Stroud's tale with the patient skepticism of a man who'd heard countless foolproof schemes. "A warm ceiling, you say? From a stove in the courtyard?" Abernathy said, leaning back in his chair. "Leland, you've been out in the cold too long." "Frank, I put my own hand on it," Stroud insisted. "You're a man who understands lumber, but this isn't about lumber. It's about air. Come see it. If I'm wrong, I'll buy a cord of your best oak and burn it in a pile just to apologize." Abernathy, intrigued by Stroud's conviction, made the trip. He walked through the Walsh cabin, touched the warm ceiling, measured the temperature, and surveyed the communal woodpile, still impressively large. He spent an hour with Ondrej Dvorak, sketching the roof design and chimney placement on the back of an invoice. As a businessman, he saw not an oddity, but a product, an elegant, repeatable solution to the single greatest problem his customers faced. He went back to his office and put his draftsmen to work. Within a month, he was advertising Abernathy quad roof kits, pre-cut and measured timber framing packages designed to span 4 standard 16 by 16 foot cabins. The kit included detailed plans based directly on Dvorak's design. That spring, as the prairie turned green, 9 new quads were built across the county, their shared roofs rising against the Kansas sky. The idea, the simple physics of it, had begun to spread. What Ondrej Dvorak built in the Flint Hills in 1903 was more than just a clever house. He had, without the language of modern engineering, created a passive heat distribution system. His design anticipated the principles of modern energy-efficient building by a century. The concept of a super-insulated shared thermal envelope and the use of radiant heating are cornerstones of today's green architecture. The idea of district heating, where a central plant provides heat for multiple buildings, is a large-scale version of what Dvorak built for 4 families. He demonstrated that by intelligently designing the container, the energy required to heat it could be drastically reduced. It was a frontier solution that was, in its essence, profoundly modern. The prairie taught a hard lesson of individualism. Survival depended on your own strength, your own foresight, your own woodpile. Every cabin was its own fortress against the cold, and every family fought its own private war against winter. The flaw in this logic was that every fortress leaks. Every wall that faces the wind loses a battle. Ondrej Dvorak, with his old-world understanding of shared systems, proposed a different geometry of survival. He saw that the wall one family lost its heat to could be the very wall that warmed their neighbor. The genius of his design was not just in the shared roof, but in the shared trust it required. It was a structure built of timber, stone, and nails, but it was held together by the radical, communal idea that what one wall loses, 4 walls can share. 4 families could be warmer, safer, and more resilient together than any one of them could ever be alone. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like it. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old-world technologies do you think could solve a modern problem? Your engagement helps us bring more of these forgotten histories to light. The video you have just watched presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and an understanding of thermal dynamics. Any application of these or similar building techniques today should be done in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.